Good afternoon and welcome back to the first European Policy Centre Friday update of the new school term. At least I always think of Brussels in terms of school terms. This is, of course, our weekly look at the key developments in relation to COVID-19 and the implications for Europe's economy, society, its global role, and for European politics in general. It's nice to see so many of you back for this at the start of the autumn season after what I hope have been well-earned breaks despite all the travel restrictions. So my name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC and I always moderate these weekly updates. And with me, as always, Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the European Policy Centre, and Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg. Very warm welcome to both of you. Welcome back, gentlemen. We're going to have, as always, a totally interactive discussion in this session based on questions first from me and then from all of you as we focus on two questions. We're going to look at what's been happening in relation to COVID-19 over the summer and assessing the EU's response and where we go from here. And yes, you've guessed it, we're going to be talking about Brexit again, the chances of a deal after a week of very angry exchanges between the two sides. Housekeeping, just to remind those of you joining us for the first time or who've forgotten over the summer because you had much better things to think about, your microphones are all muted. If you want to ask a question when I open up to the floor, you can, if you want to do it orally, click on the hand-shaped button and I will unmute you and tell you that I've done so. Or you can write your question, click on the enter a question button, write it down and hit enter. May I please make my usual plea for very short and to the point questions, Twitter length or less, so that I can see at a glance what your question is and who to direct it to. So we're going to start with the COVID developments over the summer. And Janis, perhaps if I could turn to you first on this topic, in terms of what's happened, the evolution, the number of cases and so on, what has happened over the summer and where are we now? What is your assessment of the situation the EU finds itself in as it starts the autumn term?
Well, I think that two things. One is, as we have all witnessed, is that there is a worsening of the situation at the global level, but also in Europe. We also see that a good number of countries which have done rather well over the previous period are also more affected. If you look into the situation, for example, now developing in Hungary, but also in other countries of the Western Balkans. So there is a worsening of the situation in Europe, increasing number of infections, hotspots, regional hotspots, which are strongly affected, sectorial hotspots. We see the agriculture sector, meat industry sector, but we also, that's extremely worrisome. We see that in a good number of countries, again, retirement homes are affected by higher numbers, which is worrisome. At the same time, we see that the number of hospitalizations have increased, but is not increasing at the same pace. So there are more people who are hospitalized, but nothing compared to the overall worsening of the numbers of people tested positively. Also, the number of deaths are not increasing as much at the same level as the people who are tested positively with coronavirus. However, we've seen that in the past, the experience of the first months of the coronavirus, the pandemic, was that if you have this kind of an increasing numbers, there is a danger that the situation could spiral again out of control. So there is a danger, which we were talking about before the summer of the second wave. And the second remark, and that's more of a general remark, is that my impression is that a lot of people had the hope that the situation would improve after the summer. So one can sense a certain frustration with the fact that the situation does not seem to improve, that you're not going back to a better normality. Nobody was expecting to go back to the pre-COVID normality, but maybe that situation would be better after the summer. This is not the case, and I think that you can see that there's a good number of frustration for people, but also for citizens, but also with respect to economic actors.
And that links to my second question, because we have also seen over the summer, in terms of the response, what European Parliament President David Sassoli called chaos. We must avoid chaos. There's too much confusion. Each member state is acting by itself, and only clear EU-wide rules can allow for an effective response. I mean, it does seem to have been, after an initial hope back in June, when there was more of a coordinated opening up, that since then, in response to these hotspots and all of that, incredibly chaotic response, every country having a different way of measuring the risk, and they're color coding what's a red zone, what isn't. Every country, do you test when you come back? Do you have to test before you come back? Do you quarantine? I mean, it looks like utter chaos. Is that fair?
I wouldn't say utter chaos, but there is clearly a severe lack of coordination between member states. And there is a danger that also if the situation worsens, that we might enter another phase of chaos, as we saw early on in the crisis. And this is something which I think every person in Europe is realizing, especially now in the summer period when you were traveling. It is extremely difficult to read the situation in other member states, what the rules are in other member states. There are severe differences between what the quarantine procedures are, what the rules are with respect to testing. Travel warnings throughout member states are different. Also the handling of when you enter or exit a country. So you have severe differences. And having said that, and also to be fair with respect to the European level, we also continue to see differences at the member state level, at the sub-national level, where there are differences between regions within individual countries. And in many ways, often these issues, and that's something we saw also at the beginning of the pandemic, often the reactions are rather politicized. You don't follow the advice always of those of the epidemiologists, but rather there are other considerations, competence issues between different levels. There's also sort of tit for tat policies. If you put me on a certain list, I will put you on a certain list. So there is a lack of coordination, and that is particularly pitiful, because a lot of people were already before the summer break, or even in March, April, May, saying we need to have a stronger level of coordination. Information sharing, we now have this website, Reopen EU, which is somewhat helpful to give you at least some basic information of what the situation is in other countries. But in terms of actual coordination of how to react, we're still lagging behind, and that leads to this feeling which some have that there is an increasing chaos.
Absolutely. Fabian, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, just to make 2 points. I think one is it now already shows what we discussed before, that this crisis, the pandemic and the associated economic crisis, are going to have a very differentiated impact across Europe, and that we are already seeing that in some places where we now see a resurgence, the economic impact is already worsening quite significantly. So this imbalance where everybody is affected, but some are affected much worse than others, I think we are already seeing. The second point, yes, it's absolutely true that coordination is still lacking, but I think in some way that is normal, because we are now in a situation where the policy decisions are far more complex and difficult. What we had before the summer, to say it very, very simply, was an idea that you would have a sharp shock for 2-3 months when you shut everything down. And after that, you can then go back and continue to do what you did before. Now that we know that we are going to have to live with a pandemic for quite a period of time, it becomes a much more difficult choice, because you have to balance different interests. We cannot go into lockdown for another 6 months, so you have to open some economic activity. And then the question of what economic activity do you allow? What is more risky? What is less risky? What is having more impact on the country, depending on the economic structure of that country? Is it more important to open schools than it is to open factories?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's those kind of balances which also there will be a different answer in different political systems. So we are seeing some of that divergence between countries also on that basis.
So, which will bring me in a moment to the question of the political feasibility of attempts to harmonise things. But I'm also thinking here, given, when we talk about travel restrictions and link that to the economy and business travel, if the rules are different everywhere, and if this chaos and lifting and closing continues, then that has an economic impact as well. So multiple faceted. Janis, just in terms of what might be proposed, we've heard talk of German presidency proposals. We've heard talk that the European Commission is preparing proposals. I don't know whether there's a bit of a power struggle for who launches the initiative, or whether that's just them both talking the same language. But what can we expect? What sort of proposals? They're talking about harmonizing the approach, but what things would they try to harmonize?
Well, we've seen that the German presidency is keen on the issue. They came forward with a non-paper, which already was discussed in Coreper. By the way, ambassadors gave a green light to continue these efforts to find a certain level of harmonization. We are all aware that health policies are national competences. So what we're talking about is a higher level of coordination, some harmonization, but at the end of the day, it is the national level that needs to decide on how to deal with the situation. But we have the German non-paper, which asks for a common framework to measure and to manage, incoming travelers coming from different countries to other countries, that there's a need to standardize the quarantine procedures. In some countries, you have 10 days, in others you have 14, then you have different forms of quarantine with different days associated to that. Also, further harmonization with respect to testing rules, where some member states test a very low number, others a very high number, which distorts also the comparability of data which is available. And then there are also proposals with respect to have more of a coordination or even harmonization with respect to travel warnings. So this is something which the German non-paper came forward with, but there needs to be much more discussion. The Commission will come into this too with its own proposal, where it wants criteria, how to determine the epidemiological risk, how to color code the system for hazardous areas, orange, green, red, and to find common approaches of how to handle travelers. So there are similarities between both approaches. I think there is a certain level of competition, but at least we're seeing that because of the more severe situation, there is also a bit of more political pressure to say, let's coordinate stronger together, including also the ECDC, the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, which says especially we need to harmonize testing capacities and methodologies, that this is the key in order to have a stronger harmonization at this point of the situation.
Okay, so it looks as if we have multiple member state approaches, and now we have multiple EU institutional approaches, which could even make it more complicated. But Fabian, given what you said about the lack of coordination being normal in a way, how optimistic are you that member states can be convinced to sign up to this, and at least some coordination? And I'm thinking here particularly of Hungary, which has closed its borders. EU doesn't really know what to do because it's breaking the sort of non-discrimination rules and reasonable grounds and so on. Do you think there's a chance that the political will is great enough now, and the recognition that this is going to go on for a long time, so we have to do something? Is it going to work, do you think?
I think we are not going to achieve a fully coordinated system. I think that's already clear. What I think we can achieve is a common approach, which maybe most countries sign up to, but there will also be countries where that will be very difficult to enforce. And if certain countries play politics with the rules, try to make certain points, then I find it very difficult to think that we can address that in a short period of time. Yes, if they're breaking single market rules, at some point in time there will be a reckoning, but that point in time will take at least a number of months. So I don't think we can address it in the short term. But I think even for those who are willing, we have the usual key coordination problem when we try to harmonize something, which is that member states very often say, of course we're willing to harmonize. I think it's a great idea that we all have the same rules, as long as those rules are the ones we have written, because ours are better than anyone else's. And as long as we have that kind of attitude, then we're not going to achieve it. So member states have to come together and accept that to have any kind of coordination, they also have to compromise somewhere. And that's difficult because you have to go back to your own domestic audience and explain that actually there's a benefit from coordination which goes over and above what you can do at the national level.
One other question of coordination. Yeah, sure. Sorry, Janis, please.
Just to add to what Fabian was saying, I think that there is space for progress. there is a certain level of common rules that would could put in place and a higher level of coordination. However, I'm skeptical that we will go far enough given the current situation. And interesting enough, if it's correct, if the hypothesis is correct, that during the autumn the crisis numbers might increase, the crisis might worsen. Logic would say that this should be an incentive to come closer and to coordinate even more. But what we've seen in the previous phases of the crisis is that when the situation worsens, it becomes even more difficult for member states to coordinate. So you now have a window where you can at least try to reach a higher level of coordination, maybe in a harmonization, but the longer it takes, the less the possibilities is that you will actually get further than the very, very lowest common denominator. However, having said that, this is not the last pandemic we're facing. So if we make progress now, everything we do now is putting something in place, which could be very helpful when we in future encounter similar situations.
Just a footnote, maybe, sorry, but just a footnote, I think it's important to recognize that even at the national level, in some countries, it is not actually easy to harmonize because you have different federal states, you have
which ex-member state might you be thinking of here, Fabian, particularly?
I was thinking of Germany here. So
exactly.
Why did the words Wales and Scotland come into my head immediately? I don't know.
I don't know.
Just so you know, I have one member of our audience, Jarek Reckscheidler. Thank you, Jarek, has told us Ursula von der Leyen issued a press release just as we were coming on air, as it were, confirming the adoption of a Commission proposal for a Council recommendation. So the Commission are out of the starting blocks, as it were. Thank you very much for that, Jared. I want to come on to one other issue of coordination and then turn to the MFF and Recovery Fund. Just quickly, if we could, Janis, in terms of the search for a vaccine and therapeutic treatments and so on, and indeed a lot of people saying the vaccine could still be quite a way off, therapeutic treatments are also really important. How well do you think the EU is doing in terms of coordinating the R&D, the eventual procurement, the preparation for ramping up production and so on? Is it having more success in that area?
I think that we've seen successes here, but it's far too early to judge. We will all in retrospect say as to whether the level of coordination was enough, especially when we get to the phase where we have vaccines, and the question will be, will we be able to provide people who are ready to be to receive those vaccines? Will we have enough of them? However, if you compare this at the global level, at European level, we are at least cooperating. We're putting together efforts in terms of financing research and development, providing funds to companies which have the prospect of actually coming up with a vaccine which could work. We have coordination in terms of making sure that we're buying vaccines already or preparing ourselves to be ready to buy whenever companies are ready to put them on the markets. So there is a level of coordination which we are far not seeing at the global level or in other regions of the world. So from that perspective, it is something which is positive. But at the end, we will see whether it's enough.
Absolutely. And Fabian, I mean, an interesting example of policymakers and industry really working together as effectively as possible in order to drive this forward, whether, as Janis says, it's enough and we find that vaccine or not. It does seem to be working really well in terms of collaborating to find this solution and be ready to exploit it.
Yes, I think there is a very good collaboration going on also between private and public sector. We have, of course, to also bear in mind that some of this is touching on competition concerns. Some of this is touching also on international competition. We know that certain governments are trying very hard to influence where companies are developing things, who is going to have access. But here, I think it very clearly shows that there is a distinct benefit of the European Union working together because it gives us clout, it gives us critical mass. And generally, that is, in my view, working rather well.
Let's turn now to the other key development, COVID-related, of course, over the summer, which is the beginning of the negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework, the EU budget, and the recovery fund. They started, I think, at the end of July. How is it going? Are they progressing well? Have major stumbling blocks emerged? And if they have, are they the ones we might have predicted after the summit in July? Janis, where are we?
Well, as you said, they just began the trilateral negotiation process. So these are early days and nobody should have expected any progress already. Having said that, you already see that also what we were predicting before the summer break is that you can see what the basic lines are. The German presidency representing the council saying that we took a decision in July at the highest political level. You know how difficult it was to get there. Let's not endanger the very difficult compromise we found, to be expected. The European Parliament saying we're not satisfied with the outcome of what came out in July, and even threatening to say that if our requests are not satisfied, and even specifying, say, by the end of October, we will even start contingency planning on the basis of the current budget. So we're seeing the front lines already, how they have positioned themselves, and the European Parliament is even more concrete. It says that it is unsatisfied with the fact that flagship policies like Erasmus, money for border control and things like that have been reduced. There's a strong reference to the rule of law conditionality where it says that what was decided by the European Council was enough, that it was too vague, and that it needs to be more concrete and strengthen the level of conditionality with respect to the rule of law. Then the Parliament is saying that the Parliament should have a right to police how member states are spending EU funds, that they want a greater say. As we all remember, that was one of the tough issues discussed between member states in July of what role member states will have when it comes to deciding of how other member states are spending their money. And we had this tough compromise on the emergency break, the 3 months. We all remember how difficult this was. Now the Parliament is asking for a stronger say. And last but not least, the Parliament wants to expand the scope of what money is being spent for. In terms of reforms at member state level. So you have concrete proposals from the Parliament asking things from member states. And I think that the question, which will be the most difficult one is the rule of law issue. And here Hungary is saying we will not sign off any deal, and especially the Hungarian Parliament has to sign off the own resources decision. We will not sign that off if we haven't qualified what exactly the link is between the rule of law and funding from the European level. And clarifying from their perspective means that you water it down to something which actually is not really effective in practice. So things could, especially with this issue, worsen over the upcoming weeks.
And Fabian, one last question to you on this, then we'll move on to Brexit, and I will open then after the floor for questions and comments. In terms of, we're now beginning to see the impact on the real economy. Economies are opening up and we're seeing the extent of the damage. And indeed, as we were talking about earlier with this on-off situation that we're likely to find ourselves in, we have a better sense of the likely impact. When you look at the economic developments over the summer, does this suggest to you that if the MFF and the Recovery Fund measures are agreed, that we are at European level getting the scale of the response right, or is it already clear that a great deal more will be needed?
I think the first point has to be that the uncertainty is still very high, and we don't know how things are going to develop, both overall, but also in individual countries. There will be very big differences between what happens in some countries than in others. But I think what we can already see is that some of the problems which we warned about before the summer are starting to come true. The liability trap, that there are a number of businesses which have accumulated very large liabilities during the phase of effective lockdown, who are now struggling under a debt burden, who are struggling to be able to reopen and run their businesses. What we're also seeing is the probably permanent, or at least for the foreseeable future, lack of demand in certain sectors. Their demand in some sectors has dramatically reduced from pre-crisis levels, and that will mean that within those sectors there will have to be a consolidation of businesses some businesses will have to go under. If we look at, for example, an obvious example, the airline industry, there just simply will not be as much demand for airline travel as there was before the crisis. So that will have consequences. And on top of all that, we have the big differences in the way different countries are approaching that, and in particular, how much money they're throwing at the problem. And that is going to continue to have a big impact on which companies survive, which companies don't survive, where the activity restarts after this period. And we will see that in some countries where the support is less generous, the companies will simply decide not to restart their activities there because they will be more attracted to those which can provide support.
Linking this now to our next topic, to Brexit, I'm just wondering, there is a lot of talk that the impact of COVID-19 on the Brexit negotiations should have been, or may still be, but both sides really getting more anxious to get a deal, because taking another economic hit of Brexit on top of the economic hit of COVID-19 is unthinkable. We don't see those signs, and we'll come to that in a moment from the UK as to what degree this is brinkmanship and to what degree they're serious. But is it actually true? Do you think the EU and the UK perceive this now as more important to get a deal, or somehow less important? What's the feeling now?
I think certainly both sides still are working towards a deal. They have very different ideas of what the conditions are which they're willing to accept. But both sides are also emphasizing that it's not a deal at any price. And I think there, yes, the COVID environment has changed the calculation to some extent. I think, yes, there's an argument, as you say, that given the economic hit we are already taking, another economic hit from Brexit is the last thing we need. But there's also a counter argument. There's an argument that if we are in a situation where we have permanently lower demand, where we will have to consolidate, where we will have to close factories, it might also be that for European firms, closing the factories in the UK might be the best option, especially if there's generous support available from their home country to reshore some of those activities, to do the restructuring which they would have to do in any case, given the COVID-19 crisis. So there is certainly a counter argument. I'm not saying it necessarily switches the argument around, but maybe it weakens the drive behind getting a deal. And this idea in Britain, which has come up over and over again during the Brexit negotiations, that the German car makers are going to come and rescue them.
Yeah, where are they?
In any case, but I think it might be even more unlikely now, given this lack of demand, which means they will have to consolidate anyway.
In terms of where we are with the talks, the tone this week became incredibly angry and incredibly bitter. Barnier accusing the UK of wanting to use Brexit to win new freedoms that would undercut European businesses while still having market access to the EU. And Downing Street responding, and I'm quoting here, responded, "Barnier's speech is a deliberate and misleading caricature of our proposals aimed at deflecting scrutiny from the EU's own positions, which are wholly unrealistic and unprecedented." Is this... We were in a similar situation, not maybe quite so publicly spoken, but the mood music last October was very bad, and then December we had a deal. Are we in a similar situation now, and this is mainly brinkmanship, and in the end both sides will get round the table? Or do you feel it is qualitatively different this time, and the anger really could stop either side making the sort of concessions that are going to be needed?
I think clearly in any negotiation there will be a certain level of posturing, there will be a certain amount of painting a dark picture, saying that the other side is unreasonable, saying that if nothing will happen, the other side will be at fault for not reaching an agreement. But I do think this is different. I think what we are seeing here is a symptom of underlying differences, which are still fundamental. There is a completely different view on both sides of what the final outcome of these negotiations should be. So if anything, we've moved further away from a common landing zone than we were beforehand. And that's very worrying, because if you don't have a common landing zone, then it's very hard to see what kind of compromises could get you there. If you are not even playing on the same field, it's impossible to meet in the middle. So this is the problem I think we are facing. And what I'm hearing on both sides is a rather hard line. Both sides are essentially saying the other side doesn't understand where we're coming from. The other side is in the wrong, is not actually doing what they promised they would do, is not following precedent, and that means that if nothing changes, we cannot have an agreement. And both sides are equally adamant, both in public and in private. And I think that is a very worrying sign.
Can I just follow up, and then Janis, I'll give you a chance to react to all of this. The UK keeps claiming that it is asking for no more and no less than many other countries like Canada that have trade agreements with the EU. They don't want anything special. They're just saying, treat us like you do other friends and partners. Is that true? Or, as the EU insists, are they going much further in terms, when you look into it, in terms of what they want? Or is it just that the proximity of the UK means even if they're only asking for what Canada asked for, the EU feels it can't give it because they're on its doorstep? How much of this is to do with concern about a neighbour on your doorstep, and how much is actually the UK pushing for much more than anyone else has ever asked for?
I think there are elements of both in there. Certainly, the UK is also asking for things which go beyond what is in the normal trade deals which the European Union has. It also wants certain exceptions in some areas, which we don't have in other trade deals. So in that sense, I think it's politically easy to say what we're asking for is basically Canada FTA, but that is not what the UK is actually asking for. But it is also true that from an EU perspective, it is a very different proposition to have even the same kind of deal with a country at your doorstep, where trade integration is very high, where there are a number of also special features. We shouldn't forget Northern Ireland and all the difficulty which is associated with that. Where we have seen over the last few months an increasing emphasis in the UK on divergence, on doing things differently, on competing in a different way. And that is just increasing the worry on the EU side. But in general terms, I think even if the UK accusations were true, which I don't think they are, but even if they were true, they don't change the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is that EU capitals, and this is not Barnier, this is the capitals which are driving that, will not sign a deal with the UK unless it contains level playing field conditions. That is simply a fact.
But whether you like it or not, UK, we're not doing it. We're not doing it.
Yes, and if the UK doesn't accept that, then the only possible outcome is no deal, because I cannot see that the politics in the capitals will shift.
Janis, do you share Fabian's pessimism at this stage? It's not game playing, it's not brinkmanship. There's such a fundamental division in the way two sides see the issues, let alone the possible outcomes to those issues. And how well would you say the EU is preparing itself for no deal?
Well, I think, yes, I'm sharing Fabian's pessimism. And I think that over the summer, during the summer break, the situation has rather worsened than improved. There is not only frustration on the side of the EU27, there's an increasing level of angriness with how the UK government is dealing with the situation. And that is something which we could already diagnose before the summer break, but it has increased over the past weeks. And my appreciation would be that it will not improve, it will rather worsen over the upcoming weeks and months, both because of the situation, the economic situation of the COVID-19 crisis hitting member states more strongly, plus also because, and we saw what you were referring to earlier during this week, how you have an escalation with the UK, and that I think on the EU27 side it is increasing even more the angerness, because there's the feeling they don't want to reach a deal, so why should we even try to reach that deal? And I think what is in enhancing the danger that you won't get a deal is that also on the side of those member states who have tried at least to find a compromise, who have been the more pushy ones on the EU side, you also see that these countries, these governments are becoming more skeptical, are questioning as to whether this is something which actually is worth pushing for. So if you don't have the strong advocates on the EU27 side among some member states, you have an increasing angerness overall on between member states, yes, this increases the level of pessimism. Now, are we preparing for the no deal scenario, and are we well enough prepared? I think we're preparing for the no deal scenario because it has been on the agenda for a while now. Will we be ready when the moment comes? Probably not. Neither on the UK side, but also not on the EU27 side. But the question is, can you prepare yourself to the level which would be adequate enough for a no deal? And it feels that you cannot adequately prepare. When the moment comes, you have to deal with the situation and all the negative impact of it and find the best way of dealing with it when that time has come.
I want to ask you that question, Fabian, and then one more, and then I'll go out to the room. So if anyone has a question, do either write them in or put your hand up. How do you assess the level of preparedness for a no deal? Do you think both sides are doing enough? And what do you say to those who argue in that context? Well, actually, no deal is fine from a UK perspective because we can hide the disruption inside the chaos of a no deal situation in the first few weeks. Do you buy that argument at all? Do you think that's the way the British government are thinking? And how do you assess the preparedness on the EU side?
So I think in terms of preparedness, there's two different issues. One is how much can you prepare for the things you know, and how much can you prepare for the actual moment, as Janis was saying, because in the actual moment, things will look very different. I think on the EU side, preparedness is generally rather high, not only because of the work of the Commission, but also because in the member states which will be most affected, there has been a lot of work going on over the last years to prepare for that. On the UK side, I would say not so much. There are still ideology blockages which are stopping the UK from preparing for certain things which are going to happen because they don't want to admit that these things are going to happen.
Are you talking about border controls in the Irish Sea,
for example? Chaos, yeah, we are starting to see some of the hints of that. You know, when government takes the power to build lorry car parks all over the south of England, then you know what might be coming. But these are the kind of things which are politically very difficult. I think what we are also seeing in the UK is the UK is not even prepared for a deal. So if we are talking about, for example, customs procedure, if we're talking about all of the trappings, the kind of checks which will have to take place in the Irish Sea, all of that, there's still a long way to go. So I think the UK is much further behind in terms of preparedness, and I would even question whether it's possible in the short time which is remaining to become prepared.
And on this suggestion that no deal has become more acceptable to the UK because they think they can hide the damage, you know, having promised the British public when they voted to leave that it would all be very smooth and problem-free and trouble-free, and the oven-ready deals that Boris loved to talk about. Do you think they are calculating that they can hide this within COVID? And if they are they right?
I would firstly make the distinction between the economic argument and the political argument. the economic argument simply is nonsense. It does not become easier to have Brexit because you have a large economic shock. Rather, those two shocks feed on each other. So you will have a worse outcome, and you will have less capacity to deal with the problems which will arise. So from an economic perspective, I think there's absolutely no merit whatsoever in this argument. From a political perspective, yes, some people believe that you have so much disruption through COVID that you will not notice the disruption from Brexit. I don't think that is true. I think because some of the disruptions from Brexit are going to be very obvious. If lorries are queuing at the ports, if you cannot actually move, if you have problems as individuals, if you want to travel somewhere, those are the kind of things which you cannot hide. And I think we are going to see some of these effects. I think we are also going to see some of the effects on the internal cohesion within the UK. There will be a number of people, and including, as you already mentioned, Scotland, who will be deeply unhappy with the prospect of no deal. So I think what we might well see is a deterioration also in the political circumstances.
So does that mean, though, you've talked about all the factors that are sort of counting against a deal and making the political will even less to do a deal? Does the Scottish independence question and the risk that this could lead to the breakup of the union, does that increase the pressure on Boris Johnson, as I've seen commented, a lot of people suggest, because the last thing he wants is the first thing that happens after real Brexit is Scotland votes to leave and becomes independent, you break up the UK. So is that working the other way around and maybe increasing the pressure to do a deal?
It could be an argument. I think there's also an argument which has been employed by the UK government that they simply will not give Scotland the right to vote in an independence referendum, so it will not be a question. But I think what we might see is the opposite, because even if Boris Johnson manages to get a deal, it's not going to be a deal which is going to be very attractive to Scotland. It's going to be, and in the best of circumstances, a very thin deal, which does not address many of the problems. It does not address some of the concerns, for example, about freedom of movement, where the Scottish government is very positive about EU freedom of movement, which will be taken away under any deal. And on top of that, my political judgment would be to get any deal, the UK government will have to make some concessions on fisheries. And that will be politically very difficult to sell in Scotland. Coming back with a very thin deal and you have given up some of the core demands of the Scottish fishermen is not politically something which will help the UK government to keep the UK together.
Just as a tangent, there was an intriguing comment by Michel Barnier the other day. Of course, Britain must have control over its waters, but does it necessarily have control over the fish that swim into them? I thought, I don't know what he was alluding to there or whether he was suggesting a way out of the current impasse, but we'll see. Janis, the last question on this, and then I'm going to take a couple from the floor and we'll come back on one other issue later. I mean, you talked earlier about the growing anger in national capitals and in Brussels at the tone of the British. In this sense, they're not even trying. I think in the UK, there's still a perception that everyone is obsessing about Brexit. We've talked about it many times on this Friday update, probably because it's the story that keeps on changing and twisting and there are negotiations. But overall, in terms of the level of attention, how much are member states now at this late stage really obsessing and focusing on it? Or to what extent have they said, it's going to happen, we probably think there's going to be no deal because they show no serious signs. It's become a sort of, not again, not Brexit again. I mean, which is true? High levels of anxiety or sort of resigned, and we've got much more important things to think about?
Well, first of all, when I was talking earlier about a high level of angriness, I meant among those who actually deal with the issue, who are concerned about the issue. Because actually, if you look throughout member states and you compare the situation to where it was, let's say, a year ago with respect to Brexit, there is almost no anxiety, is a non-issue. People don't actually really care about it. They're not even, it's worse, they're not aware at what stage we are. I'm talking about the normal people or policymakers who are not predominantly dealing with Brexit issues. There are other things which are so much higher on the attention scale, and the UK issue, as you were indicated, is also something which has been has annoyed a good number of people. So it's also a high level of annoyance with respect to Brexit. But a lot of people don't care, and they think that other things are more important. And as we progress now towards the autumn, towards the winter, and if the situation with respect to COVID-19, both in terms of numbers of infection, but also in terms of the actual effects on the economy, if all that worsens, I think it will be even less of an issue in member states than it is now, and already now it is not really an issue.
Thank you very much. Let's take some questions. Firstly, a written one: will the loss of Phil Hogan affect negatively the EU prospects for a comprehensive FTA with the UK and other related border trade talks with the rest of the world? The person asking, Kevin Newman, who's a consultant in Dublin and Brussels, says, I think it could. So how significant is Phil Hogan's departure? Fabian?
Well, I think we have to see first who his replacement is going to be, what kind of caliber of trade commissioner we are going to have. I think, yes, Phil Hogan was recognized as a very good commissioner who had a good command of his brief, but that doesn't mean there can't be another good commissioner with good command of his or her brief. I think the other question really is, does it make such a difference who we have as the trade commissioner? I would argue when it comes to the EU-UK negotiations, not really. I think there are far too many other issues, and it's a political negotiation. I think when it comes to technical negotiations with the rest of the world, yes, it could have an influence. It could have an influence also at the global level when we're thinking about a reform of the WTO and what we have to do there. So I think it is important that we have someone there who has the right caliber to be able to drive those forward, not least because I think we also have to start thinking about it. What we are doing with the United States if we have a change in the presidency. I think this is something where maybe Europe needs to also think about betting on the upside at some point and trying to prepare a bit more for what might be possible with a new president.
And we will come back, I think, when we know who the Irish have proposed, Ursula von der Leyen's response and what portfolio she gives, maybe at our next weekly update, which is just after her State of the Union speech, we can analyse a bit what that tells us about this commission and the importance of this moment in terms of her leadership. But Janis, one for you. Any development or any guess about the conference on the future of Europe, at least on the progress in negotiations on the joint interinstitutional declaration statement? That's from Benedetta Pricolo. Your favourite topic, Janis?
No, I hope not. But having said that, I'm joking. Before the summer, we finally had an agreement in the Council on what the joint position of the Council was. There were trilateral talks. There were some who had hoped that there would even be an interinstitutional declaration before the summer break, so in July. That didn't work out. The biggest sticking point, and there are always never just one sticking point, but the biggest sticking point is the issue of leadership. Who will be leading the conference? What competences will the leadership have? What means will it have at its disposal? So different kind of questions related to the leadership question, because obviously everyone is aware that the leadership of the conference will matter. It might make a difference. Who is leading or not leading the conference on the future of Europe? So this is the most contentious issue, which I think at the end of the day is a very political decision which needs to be taken at the highest political level. So it might even require some kind of an understanding between heads of state and government, the president of the parliament, Let's not forget, we have a European Council at the end of this, an extraordinary European Council meeting at the end of the month. So there could be progress with respect to this issue at that point in time, but we will get to the interinstitutional agreement. But even if we get there, there will be a lot of fudging, a lot of questions will remain unsolved, a lot of issues will have to be settled as we progress, and also settled and determined by the future leadership. This is why there is such fuzz about who will be leading or not leading the conference on the future.
Indeed. Let's take, I see one hand up. Let's take that. Malcolm Harbour. You're self-muted, Malcolm. If you can unself-mute yourself, I can then unmute you, I hope. And just to mention while Malcolm is, there we are. Malcolm, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, thank you very much, Jackie.
Fire away.
I wanted to come back to this question of state aid because I think what's been interesting over the last few weeks is how this has suddenly become much more of an issue, or it's publicly talked about in the UK. But as Janis pointed out, I mean, this issue about state aid for industries fundamentally affected by COVID, and particularly key industries for Europe, like automotive and aerospace, which have a lot of public visibility, are also highly relevant for the UK, which is fully integrated in that area. And it seems to me that from an EU perspective, it might be sensible to offer the UK, to say to the UK and to more publicly that actually an alignment of state aid is not something about sovereignty. It's actually about helping jobs in the UK and stopping them going to Europe. I mean, it's a paradox for me that a Conservative government, which has historically been the most abrasive and aggressive about state aid in a European context and actually encouraged controls on state aid, should now be claiming that it wants sovereignty to be able to support its own industries. And I think that that's a fundamental political weakness that could be exploited.
It's also very striking, Malcolm, because of course they were talking earlier about being a Singapore on Thames exactly. And cutting all of these things and being a very deregulated, very free economy to compete. So Fabian, a reaction on that, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we see a big shift in the way countries are dealing with state aid. And even countries like the UK, but also other countries who are traditionally very reluctant to use state aid are using it far more now, in the context of the crisis. And the controls within the European Union have become far more relaxed, arguably rightly so, but still it does mean that state aids are going through at a record level, and in particular, one country, Germany, is outspending everyone else. And that, I think, will have consequences. It will have consequences for the trading relationship between the UK and the EU. And here, I have always maintained that a level playing field condition would always have to have a degree of reciprocity. And reciprocity in this context is a far greater price for the UK than it is for the European Union. So it is in the interest of the UK to have very strong level playing field conditions, which are reciprocal, so that they can control misbehavior within the European Union, at least to some extent. And that's going to be even more difficult in the COVID context. But I think the other point I want to make, and I think this is a very important one, for the future of the European Union, is the imbalance this state aid is creating also within the European Union. And that we have some countries and the companies from those countries who are going to be permanently disadvantaged because their governments cannot or will not have the same level of support as other countries. That for me is a major issue, which we have to be discussing much more. We have to be
one I'm sure we're going to come back to. Yeah, and what I'm sure we're going to come back to in the weekly update. Just apologies to Andres Petterssons. You've asked a question about asymptomatic people and a way to determine who's actually vulnerable. Not really a question for this panel. Not sure this is an area of particular expertise. You can if it's 30 seconds.
It's 30 seconds. I think that populations would not be very happy if it is think tankers who decide who gets a vaccine and who doesn't get the vaccine. But I more generally, I think the point I would want to make is that this should be driven, of course, by the science. It should be driven by people who understand how pandemics work and what is the most effective way of stopping a pandemic. But that would still mean there's a political issue. And there will be big questions about coordination when it comes to that, because we will have the problem that, do you vaccinate school children or not, given that they have far less impact, but you might want to vaccinate them.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. I said 30 seconds, and there's one other issue I want to ask you about before we finish. Sorry, Fabian.
No.
And it relates to something we don't have time to discuss today, but we will come back to in our next weekly update after the State of the Union. There have been a lot of external issues that have been causing concern, Janis, for the European Union over the summer. Of the key ones, and I'm thinking here, Belarus, EU-Russian relations, and the Eastern Mediterranean, the tensions there. Which of those do you think, from an EU perspective, are most important, most serious, and will command the most attention in the coming weeks and months?
Well, as you say, and this is not the first time that August has been a hot moment when it comes to external relations. And to the list you mentioned, you could also add the catastrophe in Lebanon, which happened during August. But out of the list which you put up, I think that the biggest risks are related to the conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean. We're seeing a severe escalation in the relationship between Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus, but also between Turkey and other EU member states, especially France, which has become a very strong actor in the region, is very supportive, including also by showing some military force in the Eastern Mediterranean. Berlin is heavily engaged in this issue, trying to calm things down, but there is a danger that things get out of control, that everyone is playing with fire, that an accident can happen, which then could lead to a situation where a very complex situation, which is historically very complex, it is legally complex, and now it also involves issues related to energy and gas. So it is a very complex situation in a tense region, which could easily escalate. And we're talking about an escalation which would involve NATO members, Greece and Turkey potentially, an escalation where Russia is also playing a role, where Russia is not clear as to how it is positioning itself, yes, but if there's an escalation, it might become clearer. And it's not only about Greece and Turkey or about Cyprus and Turkey, it is about the EU and the relationship with Turkey, and it is about Turkey's role in the wider region, because there's more at stake than just the bilateral or trilateral disputes between three countries in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's the wider region. So I think this is an issue which actually could escalate and potentially become more worrisome. And it's no coincidence that this is something which will be dealt with at the Extraordinary European Council at the end of this month. Not only because of the pressure coming from Greece, but also because everyone is aware that there is a danger of escalation. Now, there is increasing pressure because of the sanctions threat, but let's see how President Erdogan will react to that. Up till now, his reaction has been rather negative and even increasing the tensions.
We will come back to this, and it'll also be interesting to see, maybe in the State of the Union speech, what Ursula von der Leyen says about this and what it says about a geopolitical commission, that ambition. Fabian, a last brief word, if you would, on this issue. What for you is the most important of those? Would you agree with Janis?
Yeah, I agree with Janis. Certainly we have this danger of conflict, so everyone needs to work at calming the situation down, even though there are very big differences, but still we have to avoid that it gets into open conflict. I think the other point I would make is just to also continue to look at some of the long-term trends, some of the big developments, the superpowers. Clearly we have a big change coming in the US, whether that is a new president or not. It will determine a lot of the global developments in the coming years. We have China and the developments there. So there continues to be a real need for geopolitical commission. And as you say, it'll be interesting to see how much emphasis Ursula von der Leyen puts on this issue when it comes to the State of the Union speech.
So watch this space, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you very much, Fabian. Thank you, Janis. for another great discussion. Thank you to all of you for your questions and for being with us for this hour. Just to mention before we go, the EPC has published 2 papers this week relevant to the topics that we've been discussing today: a preliminary report of a survey conducted by the EPC, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and IFOC on Brussels Bubble's views on how the EU has reacted to COVID-19 and how they see the future of Europe after the pandemic. It's a preliminary report, more to follow, but do take a look. There's also been a discussion paper on the legal ramification of the measures taken by the EU and member states in response to the outbreak. So 2 very directly related to what we've been discussing. You might also want to take a look at a discussion paper that Fabian has written on the need for an ethical framework for think tanks. Next week, look out for commentaries on Brexit and on EU-Turkey relations, and the EPC is going to publish a podcast that is recorded with the European Council on Foreign Relations on how the Franco-German tandem could work together to build a geopolitical Europe and why that matters. 3 events to watch out for next week. We're really getting underway with the autumn season now. On Tuesday, competing in Africa, the EU and US response to the rise of China, Russia and Turkey. On Wednesday, strategic autonomy for the Green Deal. It's about material supply chains. And on Thursday, making industry for the future, the strategic importance of standards. And as I just mentioned, we will be back for another Friday update, not next Friday, but the following Friday, Friday the 18th, to discuss Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union speech, analyse what it tells us about the way forward and where we go from here. So thank you again to you both. Thank you to all of you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.